Well, thank you, Dagmar. I'm not really sure who that person was who was introduced, but you'll have to do with me for this lecture. So a lot of my work has been involved in criticizing judges. I'm very quick to point out the failings of judges, and I spend a lot of time talking about them. But I decided a few years ago that I'd do something different, and that I would write about not just the failings of judges, but the successes of judges. And so this project is about what's so great about judges. In the past, I've said not much. But now I want to explain about what is great about certain judges, but not all judges, because like any other profession, there are good judges, there are bad judges, there are indifferent judges, and sometimes there are great judges. So let me begin with a rather crass introduction. This is based upon a book that I wrote called Laughing at the Gods, Great Judges and How They Made the Common Law. And this is a book that isn't just directed to lawyers or those in the legal community, but is hopefully aimed at a broader readership. So the question we need to ask, which seems rather obvious, is what is it that judges do? Because if we're going to talk about the great judges, we need to understand what they do. And so this has been a subject of great contention, and we need to think about what that means when we say there are great judges. Now, recently, when John Roberts, who is now Chief Justice of the United States, appeared before Congress, he was asked about the role of judges. And he said, judges are like umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, they apply them. The role of an umpire and a judge is critical. They make sure everybody plays by the rules. But it's a limited role. Judges have to have the humility to recognize that they operate within a system of precedent, shaped by other judges equally striving to live up to the judicial oath. He went on to say, it's my job to call balls and strikes and not to pitch or bat. Now, this is one of the most disingenuous statements that you could ever hear, and coming from a man as educated and as talented and as powerful as John Roberts, this strikes me, plays into the whole ideology of adjudication, which is we're just like, I suppose it's Canadian, so we're just like hockey referees. The game goes on, we just call infractions when they occur. This may well be true of lower court judges. This cannot be true of Supreme Court judges, the US Supreme Court, the Canadian Supreme Court, it's now called the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom. So we need to try and get behind that. And the best example, I think, of why judges are not doing this, because they can't do this, are the great judges. The great judges are not the ones you've never heard of, because umpires often think they do their job best when you don't notice the umpire. The great judges are the ones who take the stage, and to use the corny analogy of games, which is from John Roberts, they decide. Sometimes we're playing hockey, but sometimes we're going to play something else. They create the rules. And while they may indeed follow the rules, they're also changing the rules in the process of following them. And I want to try and talk about a number of judges and give an example of that. And there is a comment by Francis Bacon, which I think has some sense and gave the title to my book. Whoever undertakes to set himself up as a judge of truth and knowledge is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods. And this is a good warning to anybody who sets themselves up thinking that they're trading in truths and knowledge, and also to some extent in justice with a capital J. Right? Be very careful, beware. But I think the judges that I'm going to talk about are judges who've been prepared to risk the laughter of the gods. And sometimes they have been laughed at. But sometimes they just skated on by and have become great judges. But before I get into talking about, so what do I mean by a great judge, I thought I'd just show you this clip. It's only about 30, 40 seconds. The audio's not great. This is a man called Peter Cook, who some people might have heard of. There used to be a comedy duo called Dudley Moore and Peter Cook. And this is Peter Cook doing a routine he did often. He's got his trench coat on. He's being some fairly working class character. Now, I really hope this is going to work.
Yes, I could have been a judge, but I never had the Latin. I never had the Latin for the judging. I didn't have sufficient to get through the rigorous judging exams. They're very rigorous, the judging exams. They're noted for their rigour. People come staggering out saying, my God, what a rigorous exam. But I managed to become a miner instead, a coal miner. Managed to get through the mining exams. They're not very rigorous. They only ask you one question. They say, who are you? And I got 75% on that, so...
It goes on again. It's not...
One day I was walking along in the dark. I saw the body of a dead pit pony. I went surprised. Ever since then I've been going unexpectedly, and that's another reason why I couldn't be a judge. It destroys the dignity of the court, you see. A whooping judge is not very much welcome, but I wish I could have got into judging circles, because the trouble with being a miner, as soon as you're too old and tired and ill and sick and stupid to do your job properly, you have to go. Well, the very opposite applies with the judges. So all in all, I would rather have been a judge than a miner, because I've always been after the trappings of great luxury. I've always fancied them. Yet I've got hold of the trappings of great poverty. I've got hold of the wrong load of trappings. And a rotten load of old trappings there.
So there we go. There's Peter Cook, not to everybody's taste. Hopefully people were able to hear what he said. So I'm not going to repeat what he said, but that's basically a summary of what he said for those people who didn't know. So judges have some strange view. It's about like lawyers. You know, who likes lawyers? Nobody likes lawyers. But would you like, you know, your son or daughter to become a lawyer? And most people say, yeah, I'd be really proud of that. So it's difficult. Judges occupy a strange role. Well, I want to talk about what makes a judge great. And it certainly isn't following the rules. And I selected 8 judges. And in selecting the 8 judges across 200 years, both from the US, Canada, England, and one from South Africa, I concentrated on the idea of who were thought to be great judges, but I also tried to lay down some criteria of what I thought it was to be great. And so a place to start before I talk about these great judges and what they do is, one, to say, first of all, what is law? Right? We need to know something about what is law before we know what it is to be great about law. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but for me, law is not just a body of rules. Right? Law is an activity. It's an activity in which we create, maintain, and apply those rules. It's very much a work in progress. Law is always on the move. And in that sense, it's a little bit like a game. In that sense, it's an activity, and the people, your friends are waving over there, up in the gods. Okay? I'm sure you can just walk over, it's fine. So it's an activity. It's a work in progress. It's not about following the rules, because we're never quite clear what the rules are or what it would mean to follow them. So we have to think, well, what would it mean to be great? And a way to start is to look at people in other disciplines. We can think of a lot of disciplines. We can think of sport, the greats in sport. We can think about science. We can think about literature. Because I think there is something that's shared by all these people in what it is to be great. So, you know, we can name people. So, what do you want to go with? Literature, science, anything you want. Sports, science. Science, one of my weakest topics, but we can go with science. So who are the great scientists? Isaac Newton, Einstein, Madame Curie, Banting and Best. Seems a bit of a comedy team when you say it like that. Banting and Best. But these people, why were they great? Right? What is it about them that made them great? And I think particularly if I concentrate on those I know better, if you think about Newton and Einstein, they were not just good at doing what other people did. Right? They had great craft. They had great technique, but they had something that others didn't possess. One, they had some sort of vision, a sense of the bigger picture. Not everybody can be great, obviously by definition, but they had a sense of the bigger picture. They not only did things what other people did. For me, the key is, particularly Einstein is a good example, and Newton is, they changed the way we thought about the world. Right? They didn't just sort of change some view about science. We had a different relationship with the world as a result of what Newton talked about, and particularly what Einstein talked about. That they rethought our relationship with the world. If you think about literature, it's obvious there's a whole debate about who the greats are and how that's an ideological debate, and I fully understand that. But many of the greats were people who not just did what others did, they not only maintained the standards or sometimes exceeded the standards. Right? And that's very much true of sport. But I won't go into sport because that's not everybody's favored analogy. But they not only met the standards, they changed the standards. After they did it, nobody else could do it the same again, because they changed our understanding of what it was to do what they did. Now that to me is greatness. There are all kinds of very good performers, artists, sports people, scientists out there who do very good things, but the truly great ones, who are very rare, they change our understanding of what it is to do what they do. At least that's my definition of what goes on. And so I just want to talk about some of the judges who have done that. These 8 judges that I picked, 3 from the US, 3 from the UK, 1 from Canada, and 1 from South Africa, changes the whole idea of what it is to be a good judge. By doing what they did, they changed our understanding. And so rather than keep that in the abstract, I want to talk about, just quickly, not so much the model judge, because I don't think there's a thing called the model judge. In fact, in many ways, what all these people did was challenge the idea of what it was to be a model judge. And, importantly, which I'll say at the end, they were able to carry other people with them. They weren't just a voice out in the wilderness, because there are many rogue judges who did different things. But this bunch were the ones who changed the way we thought about it. And one of the main ways in which they did this was by putting themselves and who they were into the role of what they did. They didn't see being a judge to be a detached, impersonal activity. They were part of it. And the first one, which I won't spend time on because he wouldn't be well known to people, is Lord Mansfield. Lord Mansfield was a judge at the end of the 18th century, and he is the creator of much English private law. He was Scottish, but we can't hold that against him. He was Scottish, and when he was about 14, he walked all the way from Edinburgh to London in order to go to university. And if you tell your kids, you think you've got it tough, right? Because that's a fair trip to walk from Edinburgh to London. He soon made his mark intellectually. He hung around with people like Alexander Pope, the poet, and he went on to become one of the truly great judges, and he reformulated our understanding of law by saying that we're not just part of a legal system, but we're part of a system of justice. Now, this might appear obvious to us today, but at the time, the formalistic idea that judges really did just apply the rules was very powerful. Mansfield said, we're in a game of justice as much as we're in a game of law. And he persuaded others that this was significant. So Lord Mansfield's one of those. Any idea who this is? Anybody? This guy? This guy's seen as one of the greats, but he was great in two different categories. This is John Marshall, who was Chief Justice of the United States, and he created this idea of the judicial review, that the final voice of the Constitution would lie with the courts, and the courts would be able to tell the executive or the legislative branch of government, you can't do this or you can do this. Now, Marshall was one of these people who's hard to explain. He grew up in basically a cabin in Virginia. He was one of about 12 kids. He went on to be, before he became Chief Justice of the United States, he was one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution. I mean, this guy did it all. And in some ways, he's a little unreal. When I read about him, he's unreal. But he left his mark. And I think one of the important things about him was he was supposed to be a really nice guy as well. He didn't bully people. Some people did. Some of the other judges did. And one of his great innovations for the US Supreme Court was when they heard cases. There was only 5 of them in those days. He introduced the idea of having wine at their judicial conferences. So after each case, they'd retire to discuss the case, and Marshall would produce a few bottles of wine, and people would drink theirs, and they'd loosen up, and he could, nudge them in what he thought was the right direction. So that's John Marshall, one of the true greats of American jurisprudence. The next one is also an American. People may have heard of this judge. This is a judge who says, if you really want to make it, you got to have a good name. Right? Yeah, if you have a good name, it works well. And this is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Senior was his dad, who was an author, wrote a book called Autocrat at the Breakfast Table. But Oliver Wendell Holmes sat on the court until he was in his 90s. Oliver Wendell Holmes was his own man. He didn't march to the beat of anybody else's drum. He did what he wanted to do. He was a professor at Harvard Law School in his 20s. He went on to the Boston or the Massachusetts courts and then made his way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. He laid out forthright opinions, and one of the most important things he did was said that lawyers have to take into account social facts. Law didn't operate as a world unto itself. You had to connect law to what was going on in society. This again may sound rather trite to us, but in fact that was one of his major contributions. He left his mark also because he was what some people thought, and he was a great stylist. Right? He wrote very distinctive judgment. He didn't ramble on for pages. He tended to be pretty short and pithy. But Ollie was one of the great judges. You'll notice, of course, at this stage, we're very much into men, and I'll correct that a little later. This guy's less well known outside the legal community, but he's seen as one of the greats. He's called Dick Atkin, known as Lord Atkin, and he wrote judgments that have laid down, and he wrote in the 20s and 30s and a little bit into the 40s. He wrote great judgments that established private law, modern private law, particularly law of torts, and about the duty to take care, product liability. This man has a fascinating past, and his past connects with what he did as a judge. He thought you should concentrate upon what the man in the street, that would be his phrase in the 1920s and 30s, what they were after. The law should be designed so that it served the person in the street. Dick Atkin was born in Australia. His parents had gone out there to make a new life for themselves in the late 1800s. His mother and father had split up. His dad was a bit of a drunk. His mother came back. He was about 5 at the time. They came back on a month-long trip. There weren't a lot of single mothers doing that. He had 2 younger siblings. He went back to Wales, Aberdyfi. He's called Lord Atkin of Aberdyfi. And as a fascinating past, for me, one of the more appealing things was he was just an ordinary kid out there, and a teacher took a special interest in him and saw things in young Richard that he didn't see in himself. And he enabled him to take a scholarship, and he went to a fancy private school and was able to fulfill his academic potential. And he went on to be a leading judge. His life, for good, was dominated by a very strong single mother, a very strong grandmother. He ended up marrying a woman who was also from Australia, who he met in London, and he went on to have 5 daughters. I have 3 daughters, and 5 daughters seems a lot of daughters. There's a wonderful There's a wonderful story about him that after he heard the famous case, it was about a woman who drank some ginger beer. There was a snail in the ginger beer. And he went home and said to his kids, look, I had this case. What do you think I should do? And one of his kids apparently said, according to the biography of one of his daughters, Daddy, I think you should introduce in the law a precept like, love thy neighbor and make it do not harm thy neighbor. And he did. If you ever looked at his judgment in a case called Donahue and Stevenson, the foundation of law is you owe a duty of care to whoever is your neighbor. And he built this, apparently, on the story from his daughter. So that is Dick Atkin. And he talked, as I said, he was a great judge because he took the position of the person in the street. This guy, dressed in his threads, what Peter Cook would say the trappings of luxury, as opposed to the trappings of poverty, is probably is the most famous judge of the 20th century. In fact, he lived all 100 years of the 20th century. He was born in 1899 and he died in 1999. He was a judge into his 90s, and this is Lord Denning. Lord Denning was, if ever someone was his own person, this was the guy. He's one of these people who went through university in a couple of years. He did a triple degree in math, philosophy, and law. And it's all depressing stuff for someone like me to know that. But he left his imprint. He had a very strong vision of really an England that was beginning to recede. A very bucolic image. He was very much he claimed to be a populist, but there was a certain kind of elitism involved in this. He went all the way up to the House of Lords and then realized that he'd be much better if he got out of the House of Lords. The House of Lords said its group was 5. You got to swing 2 others, therefore, to get them to come your way. So when a vacancy came up as the head of the Court of Appeal, he dropped down. And that gave him 2 advantages. The Court of Appeal sat as 3, so he only had to pull over 1 to get a 2. And as the chief judge, he decided what judges he sat with. Right? So he was pretty good at picking the people, at least one of them, who was going to go with him. But he left his mark. He ended his career, sadly. He was a controversial character, and he got very controversial at the end in talking about juries, and we needed real English people on juries, and that was taken as code for saying we don't need certain immigrants in there, and he ended up resigning in unfortunate circumstances. But it's a good example of a judge who left his imprint on the law and wasn't necessarily liked. You don't have to be liked to be great. And that sort of ticks off the debate about things like, if you talked about history, who are the great figures in history? Stalin, was he great? Hitler, was he great? And there's an argument for saying, well, it depends what you think great is, right? If you look at the impact and influence, Hitler's right up there, right? Not one of the good guys, right? But maybe great. So that was Lord Denning, an English judge. The next one is a man also called Marshall, who's an American. He's called Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the first black judge appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. This in itself was a distinction. He did this in the 60s. He became a judge. Many people have said that he was much better as a lawyer than he was as a judge. But one of the things was, not just because he was the first black member of the court, but he brought that into what he thought a judge should be. He brought his experiences. He was born in Baltimore, I think in 1907. At the time, there were still lynchings going on. There were segregated public facilities. He could never have imagined, he said, that he could become, a lawyer, let alone a justice of the Supreme Court. He argued 32 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won 30 of them. And that's an incredible record, particularly because in nearly all those cases, he represented the National Association for Colored People, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So when you're arguing in the 40s and 50s on behalf of African Americans and you're winning 30 out of 32, you got something going for you. He was also a bit of a lad, if people understand what that phrase means. He liked to get out and about. He was big into the Harlem jazz scene. He was very much seen as part of the African American community. He was loved by the people who worked for him. He always used to wear white socks, and people are telling me they thought that was very unstylish. He said, that's great, right? He liked to be, there's a famous story about him. If you ever go to the US Supreme Court, there's an elevator that takes you up the floors to the justice's offices. He got in one day, and two other people got in. They were white, and they thought he was the elevator operator, and he went along with that. Took them up there, asked which judge they were going to see, took them to their office, and then introduced himself. And so he made some great judgments. He was a fervent opponent of the death penalty. And unfortunately, when he became a judge, the court was turning away from the liberal court of Earl Warren and becoming a more conservative court. And he was too often a dissenter in judgments, but a great judge. The next one, sorry, I need to go down. The next one, who is this? Young lady over here, who's this? Bertha Wilson. This is Bertha Wilson. Anybody know who Bertha Wilson is? Bertha Wilson was a Canadian. And she was the first woman in the mid-80s, first woman ever appointed to the Canadian Supreme Court. There have only been five or four? I'm struggling. 5 other women, I think, that have been appointed to the Supreme Court since her. But she was a path breaker. The interesting thing is about her was, again, she brought herself into the judgments. She saw herself as a woman in society, and when she wrote judgments, she talked about that. This was controversial. She gave a famous lecture at this university called, "What Difference Will Women Judges Make?" And she said, they'll make a difference. There was a lot of debate about whether people agreed with the difference she thought they'd make, but she put herself in judgments. And if you read, for instance, the judgments in the Morgenthaler case, then in fact her judgment is where she puts herself, people will perhaps know Morgenthaler's about the criminalization of abortion, she puts herself in the judgment and talks about being a woman and why that experience in talking about matters of reproduction and women's freedom was important. She has a fascinating backstory. Even though she was a graduate of the Dalhousie Law School, she didn't go to law school till her late 30s. Before that, she'd graduated in Scotland. She'd got married immediately she left university to a man called John Wilson, who was a Baptist Methodist minister. They came to Canada, the Ottawa Valley. She spent around 15 years playing the role of the Methodist minister's partner, wife. He became a chaplain in the Navy. That took her to Halifax. And then she thought, maybe I should go to law school. And she went to law school. She did very well in law school, even though she was discouraged by the dean from doing graduate studies because she was a woman. She had trouble getting an articling position, which is the apprenticeship position for lawyers. But she then had a quick rise, came to Toronto because her husband came to Toronto, worked for a law firm, and then caught the eye of what was then the Trudeau government, and she had a rise through the Ontario Court of Appeal to the Canadian Supreme Court. And she left a mark on that court because she changed our understanding, along with people like Thurgood Marshall, that our identity and therefore our experiences are not things that should be left out of law, but should in fact be brought into law and what it is. And my last judge, anybody know what this guy's called? Young lady over here? Albie Sachs. Anybody heard of Albie Sachs? Albie Sachs, do you like his shirt? He used to love wearing these shirts, Albie Sachs. He's been to the university here a number of times. He's now retired. Albie Sachs is a South African. And one of the reasons that I think he's great is because of his backstory and how he brought that into judging. He lived in South Africa. He grew up in South Africa, and he was part of the struggle. He went to prison because of his activities against the apartheid regime. He joined and was part of the leadership of the ANC, along with Nelson Mandela. When Mandela went to prison, he got put into exile. He went to Mozambique, where he taught law and also had taught law previously in London. While there, he survived an assassination attempt which blew off his arm and also damaged his eyesight. And you can see his left, well, you can't really, but his left arm is missing. And he always wore these shirts, which I never liked, but he thought were great. And he always left his left sleeve hanging. He didn't fold it up and put it away. He left it hanging because for him, this was to show, in a sense, it was his badge of being what would be fairly called a revolutionary. And his big challenge as a judge was, and he was appointed by Mandela to the first constitutional court in South Africa. And what he did, both in his writings outside the court, but also in his judicial writings, was to put in play the fact that he had a challenge. He was a revolutionary. He was committed to the cause. But he also accepted that as a judge, he had to follow the rule of law. And the rule of law puts a lot of pressure upon judges to try and leave some of that behind and, as it were, as John Roberts said, follow the law. Right? Albie said, I can't just follow the law because I need to be true to what it is to be a revolutionary and how many people laid down their lives to overthrow apartheid. Sometimes he said he got it right, sometimes he didn't. But Albie Sachs, I think, is worthy of that. He's the only judge of my 8 who is still alive. He lives by the beach outside of Cape Town. It's a very nice place to be, and he still wears these shirts. So, those are my judges. I'll just wind up. Are we getting near wind up? And then questions, of course. But, is there anything that we can say about these great judges as a group? What makes them great? And I think, in a sense, there isn't. Because what makes them great is, to some extent, in their own terms, they were unique. They changed what it was to be a judge. Their background, they all had remarkably varied backgrounds in what they did. There's no one particular background that leads you to greatness. Ideology, politics, there was no pattern to the values and prejudices that they had. Some were progressive, some were conservative. Right? They were different. Timing, well, like comedians, judges need timing. Right? And I think for many of them, as always in history, they came at the right time for them. History was on their side. The forces of history allowed them to be great. Longevity, well, some were on the court a long time. Oliver Wendell Holmes was on a long time. Denning, my recollection, Denning went on the 40s, was nearly 50 years on the court. Myrtle Wilson was a few short years. So that isn't part of greatness. The others are popularity. I've said this before, doing good. Right? Is that a requirement to be great? I'm suggesting not. There are great judges, there are great people who are not necessarily always on the side of the gods. Right? There's a debate about that, and I recognize some people see that as a criteria, but I don't. Character, yeah, there's no one personality type. Some were rather bullies, right? Others very humble in what they did. I think Myrtle Wilson is a good example of someone who showed humility. And then also style. The great judges have to have style, writing style or other style. And I would say, no, if you look at these judges, some of them were great stylists. Wendell Holmes is a good example. Others were not. Atkin wasn't the most stylish writer, but he was able to connect with what he thought was the people he wrote for, which wasn't just lawyers, but was people. So, how can I wind this up? One way to come at this is to say, well, would we want all these 8 on the same court? Would this be the dream team? And the answer is, of course it wouldn't be the dream team, right? I mean, to use, if I can use a hockey example, would you want, maybe you would you want all the players on the team to be Wayne Gretzky? And the argument would probably be, no, you need other people to do different things for balance, right? So you wouldn't want all of them. There's a nice anecdote. Richard Nixon in 1970 decided to nominate Harold Carswell to go on the Supreme Court of the United States. And his big defense of him was that he was mediocre. And Nixon, and particularly one of his spokespersons, said, well, even if he were mediocre, there are lots of mediocre judges and people and lawyers. They're entitled to a little representation, aren't they? And a little chance. We can't all have Brandeis's, Frankfurters, and Cardozos. Those were three great American judges, but not great enough, in my view, to make the cut. But it does raise a good point, right? Which is, do we want greats on the court, or do we just want, ultimately, ordinary people? I'd vote for greatness, but others may vote for ordinariness. And my last comment is, Carswell got knocked back by Congress. They wouldn't appoint him. So Nixon had to pick someone else. Now, Nixon was quite a conservative character, although a very smart guy. And as his replacement, he picked Harry Blackmun. And Harry Blackmun was appointed, I think, 57-0. Harry Blackmun went on and wrote one of the most radical judgments ever in United States history, which he was able to carry enough of his fellow judges and to some extent the rest of the country, and it remains a point of contention today. And does anybody know what that judgment would be? Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade introduced the rights of women to obtain an early termination of their pregnancy without interference from the state. It's usually about the first trimester. So, you know, it's quite interesting that Nixon started off going for Carswell. He was a mediocre, he was very conservative. He ended up putting Harry Blackmun on the court, who was one of the few judges who transformed in his career. He was a Republican, and he was conservative. The story is that Blackmun's daughter became pregnant and ran into a lot of difficulties in seeking to terminate, at the time, her pregnancy. This left a great mark upon Blackmun, and he then penned the Roe v. Wade decision. So, what's so great about judges? That's my cut. So, I'm happy to take any comments or questions or whatever.